All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to ViiV Healthcare's 2021 Link Expert Exchange. Thank you all for taking the time out of your days to join us today. We're really excited to have you with us. For those of you who do not know me, I am Megan Falkenhan. I am the Senior Operations Manager of External Affairs North America here at ViiV Healthcare. Just a little bit of background. We launched the Link in 2020. Given everything that was going on in the world due to the pandemic, the Link was how we reimagined our learning communities. We designed it to really reinforce and strengthen our strategic approach to building and supporting relevant learning networks throughout and beyond the pandemic. And this year, we continue to use innovative and inventive and engaging strategies to make content and cohort building accessible, productive, and original. So I guess then on the bright side of us having to all be stuck at home for the last year, and due to the virtual nature of most meetings and events last year, we were able to capture a ton of really high quality, amazing video content from our various convenings throughout last year, including our 2020 Community Summit. So we're excited to replay some of the content here today for our wider audience. We have invited our panelists from last year's virtual Community Summit Opening Plenary, which was titled Resilient, Resourceful, Responsive, Visionary Change in the HIV Movement, back today to pick up and build on the conversation from where they had left off almost 7 months ago. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Kenyon Farrow. Kenyon?
Thank you so much. And hi, everybody out there, wherever you are. My name is Kenyon Farrow, and I am a writer and activist and been doing this work for a long time. And have worked with a number of organizations currently with Prep for All. I've also worked with Treatment Action Group and former senior editor of The Body. I'm still a contributing editor to The Body, if you know the website. But I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today. I think as those of you who were with us last November when we started this conversation, resilient, resourceful, responsive, visionary change in the HIV movement, we were at a real crossroads in this country, and I don't really have to reiterate all of the things, but we were obviously in the midst of election season. We were in the early part of, or in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're just at the precipice of COVID-19 vaccines rolling out around the country another month or so later, and I think we started that conversation last year to really sort of discuss what does it mean to be, a leader in the HIV movement in the midst of so much, not just national, but global crises and multiple overlapping crises. And we thought it would be important to maybe pick up and 7 months later, as we've, seen some sort of changes, in the country, where we are in terms of thinking about leadership and reflecting on where we've been. So we're going to take a look at some of the actual footage from the conversation from last November, as well as engage our panelists in the conversation today. One programmatic note, one of our panelists who was with us last year, Cassandra Frederic, who is the Executive Director of Drug Policy Alliance and my homegirl, could not be with us today, but we have the rest of our esteemed panelists with us. And we'll just move now, and I'll let the panelists, who are with us introduce themselves to you, and then we will jump into our presentation. So I'm going to start with Andrea.
Hi, Kenyon, and hi, everyone out there. My name is Andrea Jenkins. I am based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I stand on Dakota, Lakota, and Anishinaabe and Ojibwe land, unceded land that was stolen, and we always want to contextualize that we are in a country built with slave labor, and so I live and work in Minneapolis. As I stated, I am on the Minneapolis City Council. I serve as the vice president. Prior to that, I was a transgender oral historian. I'm a writer, artist, performance artist, educator, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today, Kenyon, and all of my panelists.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And we'll now turn it over to Angel to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. My name is Angel Fabian. I am the advocacy coordinator with Impact Global Action for Gay Men's Health and Rights. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and when I'm in phase, she and her, and I'm becoming very comfortable with they. And I am coming to you from occupied Ohlone territory in Oakland, California. And reminding everyone that, you know, the peoples of this land are still around and very much fighting for their land back and definitely for reparations. Just grateful to be part of this amazing group of folks who had the pleasure of being sharing space with last year, and ready to continue the conversation and ready to continue doing the important work. And also wanting to bring into the room Marco and his presence. And Marco Presente, Marco Presente, Marco Presente. One of our dear activist friends, colleagues, comrades, artists who we just lost last week. So thank you, Kenyon, for the invitation.
Thank you, Angel. And last but certainly not least is Mark. Have you introduce yourself?
Hey folks, my name is Mark Jones. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I am coming to you from Ohio for like the last heartbeat of time before I relocate to Seattle. And I am the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness System or Authority, which oversees all of the homelessness work in King County. That's the relocation. So straddling two places right now, both of which are also occupied land. And I'm always here to have a conversation about reparations so that, like, you know, we can sort of get the party started, you know?
Right, thank you for getting the party started, Mark. I think as you all did in different ways. But before we get into our conversation, just want to kind of say to our tech folks, we should get set up for the first video clip from the conversation from last year. We were discussing, I think, what we were looking forward to in 2021. So we'll take a look at that clip, and then we'll come back and discuss how our panelists feel 7 months later. Looking forward to 2021, which is upon us. But what are you building towards? What does 2021 look like or mean in the context of your work and community? And what are the possibilities that you're most excited about? What can we bring into fruition for people, in our communities? And we'll start with Andrea.
So thank you, Kenyon. You know, I'm looking forward to really digging into this entire conversation around public safety and what is the role of policing in our society. I mean, clearly, Mark laid it out. The level of racism is very deep in our architecture, right? These systems were designed and work the exact way that they were intended to. And what I struggle with, however, is as we are reimagining and consequently rebuilding a new system, like if this was a house, right, we would remodel our house and we would move out. We would maybe go to a hotel, maybe we go stay at mom's house for 6 months while the house is getting rebuilt, but in rebuilding our public safety system, we don't have that option. I mean, I guess some white people can go to Greece or to Paris, the south of France, and wait till we come up with a new public safety system and then come back. But all of our people, my cousins in Chicago, which one of them was murdered last night, um, you know, we don't have that option. We are going to be in these communities while this reimagining process is happening, and how do we keep people safe in that mid term, in that sort of interim time period as we are reimagining and rethinking and configuring, which absolutely has to happen. And so that's the work that I'm going to be focusing on, really digging into a real truth and reconciliation process in the city of Minneapolis, and the thing I keep telling staff is that, because they're all applauding, right? They snapping too, but it's like, it's not just the truth that we got to tell. We also have to reconcile. Like, there has to be some recompense that comes with this. So get ready, because we're going to be asking for big numbers, and that has got to be a part of the reality, and that's kind of where my head is for 2021.
Thank you, and just want to offer my condolences to you and your family in your very recent loss. So thank you for being here with us today, given that current reality. So I'll turn to Angel to talk to us from your perspective about 2021 and beyond. What are you hopeful for? What opportunities do you see us being able to build towards in the coming years?
So thank you for the question, and thank you for everyone's contribution so far. I know that we need more advocates, and we need more community voices to be represented at the table, and to be invited, and sometimes push and then build a table. And I know that we need to continue advocating for adequate resources to reimagine the delivery of services and what is preventing folks from accessing services, inclusive of culturally humble and linguistically accessible services. And we use the word comprehensive sexual health because that encompasses the wholeness of a person. That encompasses housing and food that is going to be critical, as we continue in this recession and through this epidemic. That includes mental health and harm reduction services made available to community members. That includes education and employment opportunities, which are a source of strength and purpose for many community members, regardless of immigration status. And that's key. What excites me the most, I think, is the coalition building, the strategic and intentional coalition building that we are able to continue building with Black communities, with Indigenous communities, with API communities. And yes, some white communities, as long as they're doing their anti-racist work, because we're not gonna lift stuff that doesn't belong to us. And and continue building this movement, because I think it's too important not to reimagine what a future for our communities and our country could look like. I tell my kids, I'm also a house father, I'm a father of the House of Revlon, and I tell my kids, look, y'all, this is survival. This is survival, because if it affects, we live in the same community. If it affects, one of us, it affects all of us. They don't, and it's based on zip code. It's not based on, how you look. It's based on zip code. So very, very important to do those links, and to really show up for one another, and be very intentional about that. Again, like I mentioned before, we have a lot of work to do in the Latinx community. Um, you know, uh, what has happened has forced us to have those conversations with our family members, our parents, our community members, around how racism has infiltrated through colonialism our communities, and the work that we still need to do around that.
My team is very focused on housing. We do a lot of work in the housing and homelessness space. And this past year, we launched a Center for Housing Justice. We're very focused on integrating justice and liberation frameworks into all of the policy and strategy work that we do. And I really, I want to, again, emphasize, and this came from some of what Cassandra said, right? I don't think we know to the 100th percentile what justice or liberation actually is, right? I think that there are brilliant people who've done deep work imagining liberated spaces, imagining justice-based worlds, right? But I don't think that we as sort of the meta level community actually have that agreement on this is where we're headed. And I think oftentimes that gets a little bit in our way. But I do think that what my team has been thinking a lot about is that there is no end to homelessness without housing justice, right? That the creation of a world where we are all housed, safe, able to thrive is not actually about, right? It's not about services. It is a story about the material realities, right? It's about money. It's about investment in community. It's about whether or not we as a nation believe that communities deserve to thrive. And to the council member's point about asking for big checks, right? I think the time has come for us to ask for some big checks, some very large numbers, right? That say, look, the time has come for us to say the community can't keep making $1 out of this 10 cents. And if you really are about it, right, then you have to give us the whole $10, right? To your grandfather's point, Kenyon. And what that, I think, in turn points me towards is this idea and sort of, again, thinking about liberation, I think we're also going to start doing a lot more rural organizing in 2021. I think that what this election showed us, right, is that the Democratic strategy, and just so everybody knows, in the words of Congress, I caucus with the Democrats, don't consider myself a Democrat. So longtime ally, but not necessarily, those aren't my kin, right? But to be clear, right, that the Democratic strategy of running up numbers in urban centers while the Republicans run up numbers in rural environments is not a long-term electorate strategy, right? It doesn't make sense. And it pits urban environments against rural environments in a way that ultimately only helps rich people win, right? And that's not actually what we're about. We want to make sure that we are taking a true intersectional analysis, a class analysis, a race analysis, and saying look, there are poor Black and brown folks in rural areas, there are poor Black and brown folks in urban areas, and there are white folks winning in both of those, and it ain't us, right? So how do we begin to have that conversation? And in thinking that through, right, I also want to be really clear that our strategy, and I'm guilty of this, right? I work predominantly in urban environments, and I would consider myself largely to be an organizer who works in urban spaces. We show up in those rural environments during election cycles, right? They don't have a relationship with me. They don't don't know that I actually believe that the vision that I have holds them in it, right? And so we need to be there year round. And it needs to be there not just when we're asking for their vote, it needs to be when we're asking for their imaginative energy to craft a world together. And so I think that for me, moving into 2021, I will be driving out into the country and having a lot of uncomfortable conversations and maybe hightailing it back into the city like a couple times, but then hopefully like with less frequency, right? Because we build those relationships.
All right, thank you. So that was really interesting for me to watch and go back 7 months and see kind of where, where we all were at that time. And I want to, kind of pick up with Mark first, since we just ended with your video and talk about some reflections that you may have on that. So I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do that, I just would be remiss if I didn't also say Angel did a beautiful thing by kind of bringing Marco Castro Bohorquez into the space, who we recently lost. And I also want to bring, because we lost her, I think the day after Marco, is Lauren Jones, who's a member of Positive Women's Network, longtime Bay Area activist. I met Lauren in 2008 when I was organizing work around, I kind of pulled together like a kind of a retreat of criminal justice and prison sort of health activists, healthcare activists, to talk about HIV criminalization. And Lauren was there, and she was an amazing activist. And I want to also honor her passing as well. So I want to set that aside for a second, and again turn over to Mark. One of the things, Mark, in that clip, you talked about the kind of urban-rural divide in electoral politics, and obviously things that we did not predict would happen in the span of 7 months after the presidential election, from January 6th on to a number of efforts in different states to really make what, many of us already were, kind of critical of our sort of electoral systems in this country, but, have essentially efforts that are trying to sort of make even elections not matter if a legislator decides to essentially overturn an election. So I want to just get a sense from you, kind of what you're thinking about, reflecting on your comments about really an urgency in addressing this sort of urban-rural divide, and how that's playing out in what we're seeing in the sort of electoral politics that's happening at different state levels today.
Yeah.
I know. Here we go. Do your best.
It's funny, right? Because most of the time I feel like Cassandra, right? Where I'm like, why won't anyone listen to my prophecy? And this time I was like, it was much worse than I thought. So exciting. But I do think a couple things are of note, right? One is that what I was talking about there in terms of ideological echo chamber and the insistence on geography as the boundary of that ideological echo chamber has, I think, only continued to unfold. And we see that in how states are taking up the legislation that they are passing, right, to limit voting. And I think that I will go on to say actually that we more importantly see that play out in how it is covered in the media, right? So it's the sort of like evil Southern states who are eviscerating the voting rights of historically marginalized communities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we would all be remiss not to say, right, that that's not what's happening. And in fact, right, the deeply, and I hesitate to even use the word conservative because, not to be old, but when I was a child, conservative meant something, and I don't know what it means anymore. But the states that are passing this legislation or are engaged in these conversations to my mind, right, are being held hostage by an entrenched group of conservative elites who have made it impossible to remove them. And that's actually what's happening, right? And so when we narrativize our divides geographically, we forget that like Texas is massive and a lot of people live there. Like a lot of people do not agree with the actions of their state legislature, right? And it has become impossible for them to make their voices heard through the nominal democratic process, which has become profoundly anti-democratic, right? And so in that space, like I would sort of continue to posit that what's most important to us now is the work of collective imagination. And that, I was reading something the other day and I forget exactly what it was, so I can't attribute this, but please simply know that it is not me. But there's a quote that jumped out at me, which is, so much of the work of oppression is the policing of imagination. And I was thinking about the work that I've done in my research life, trying to understand safety and thriving in Black and brown communities in New York and other places across the country. And the conversation over and over again in a lot of those focus groups and interviews really came down to, I haven't had the time to imagine what those would look like for me, right? Like, I'm so busy surviving. I'm so busy trying to like eke out an existence inside this oppressive framework that like, if you ask me to imagine myself thriving, the best I can imagine is rest, right? Like I can't imagine on the other side of feeling rested. And so I think that I continue to sort of double down on like the only way out of this moment is not at the federal level. It's not, sort of passing giant bills. I mean, it'd be great if we could pass it. It'd be great if we didn't have, I'm not gonna name any senators, but we all know who I am thinking about. It would be great if that was not the obstacle that was in front of us right now. Do not get me wrong. But I think that the real work, right, the antidote to the present crisis continues to be in the making and building a transformational relationship that spans the ideas of each other that we have, both in terms of geography, but then also other sort of identities. And the last thing I'll say before turning it back is just that, like, and in my present work, right, that has become more and more apparent in every conversation that I've had, right? So I am responsible for administering a system that will come to serve the 12th most populous county in the country. Not everybody agrees, right? Like, and what I have said repeatedly is my job as a public administrator is not to say like my way or the highway. My job is to say like, we have agreed on democracy and we can, until we have a different agreement, the job that's in front of us is to talk about it and talk about it and talk about it until we have a path forward. And if we're unable to do that, then we no longer want a democracy.
Wow, thank you. Angel, kind of thinking about your clip and your remarks there, you talked a lot about community and how you were thinking about community at that time in November. And I'm curious to know, and these all things sort of tie together coming from what Mark just sort of like offered. How are you thinking about the role of building, rebuilding, reimagining community? And I would go so far as to even say, rethinking this question of democracy, as Mark also, kind of mentioned, and what a kind of a multiracial democracy in the United States could look like and is possible right at this point. So I just want to hear you reflect kind of on your comments around this thread of community and what you're thinking about in the present moment versus 7 months ago.
Wow, that's a big one.
Y'all are the big thinking group. So
yes,
that's
something that has not, changed is democracy for whom. And I say that because, one of the things that we were looking forth although we knew that there was going to be some glitches along the way, was on immigration reform, for example. Why I'm focusing on that with regards to community is that, some of the comments that were made yesterday by Vice President Harris kind of, said in on the wrong way, specifically because deportations, have continued to happen during this administration. Um, and the role of the U.S. intervention in South America and Central America and in Mexico, to destabilize countries to the extent that people need to flee their countries, not being addressed or not being highlighted is it's a little problematic for me. Likewise, I don't know if folks are keeping track of climate change, but once climate change really hits, there's going to be mass migration from the global south to the global north, and then, we're really going to have to talk about migration and migration issues. So I think for community members who are doing some advocacy work around equity, around democracy and how democracy looks in community, specifically around immigrant rights issues, I think that, we just need to continue holding folks accountable, and there's going to be a lot of accountability that needs to happen even with this administration. Why? Because even in the immigration reform plans that they currently have, it's leaving a lot of community members out of the picture. If you have any touch with the criminal justice system or unjustice system, you are out of the running. I'm sorry, you're out of the running for any type of naturalization process that could potentially benefit you, and those around you. Because we have a lot of, we're connected to communities, whether in this country or in our home country. I think for continuing to build coalition, I think what's going to be important to continue educating each other around the political frameworks that hold inequity in place, that continue to show up in disparities in all sorts of health conditions, including HIV, including COVID, including Hep C, including STIs, and build those key allyships that are going to move, a just agenda forward. I think that that we cannot veer from that, no matter who is currently in administration. And remember that those of us who are paying taxes or can pay taxes or are able to vote, to hold those individuals accountable. A lot of folks forget, and I have had some pushback with when, I kind of ask for what our communities need to federal officials, that, I should be a little bit more respectful. And I don't think I've ever not been respectful, but I also have to remember them that, their salaries, their positions are funded through tax dollars. So in essence, they, as taxpayers, we have to hold them accountable, not the other way around. And so I think that we have to be very clear around, our roles and our voice when we're asking for what we need, when we're advocating for what communities need and are in that dire need of. And be, as I think many colleagues say, unapologetic about that. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And lastly, Andrea, you talked a lot about in the video about kind of transformation, and again, sort of the sort of theme of reimagining things. And you are in Minneapolis, where we have finished the Derek Chauvin trial, and in the midst of that, there was another police murder. At least one that I know about, and obviously awaiting sentencing and those sorts of things. But I, want to also ask you about specifically your location, because it has been such the site of a particular locus of issues in the United States, right? Around policing, around kind of what has been for the rest of us a kind of invisibilized sort of racial disparities in the success of Minneapolis, right? As is often, kind of talked about, that some of these kind of police murders have elucidated. So I'm curious to you, kind of like from your vantage point, both as a city council member, as a resident of the Twin Cities, where are you kind of seeing things locally, and the possibility for that transformation you spoke of 7 months later?
Well, the trial hadn't begun yet at that point in time, and now it's over, and it was guilty on all 3 counts. And so, it's an anomaly in many ways, right? That a police officer is being held accountable for the murder of an unarmed Black man. But, hopefully that will set a new sort of precedent, as it were. And even prior to that, Minneapolis was pretty in the news a couple of years prior for sending a Black officer to jail for killing a white woman. And so, we're starting to see some level of police accountability. But again, it is not the systemic change that we need to really create that kind of reality all around the country. And you're right, Kenyon, certainly there was another murder, police involved murder, Dante Wright, in the midst of the trial, but we just had another police murder last week of a Black man. There were no video cameras, no body cams, so that's going to be a really interesting situation to see what the investigation leads to. But if we are to see change in our communities, then that would mean that there's going to be some differences in this investigation. I think in the Dante Wright situation, immediately, it didn't take weeks, it didn't take months. The state prosecutor the state attorney general is now prosecuting that case, which was a lesson I think learned from the George Floyd murder. And I mentioned reparations and the Truth and Reconciliation process, and that process has begun. But to really create this sort of new reality, this new I was kind of struck by what Mark was saying about we don't really know what justice looks like, and how do we get to it? And that's what we're finding. So we've embarked on this Truth and Reconciliation process, and it is, we complicated it ourselves, I think, because we included our Native brothers and sisters, as well as African American folks. And, you know, the oppressive nature of white supremacy is the same, but how it impacted those communities are different. And so, you know, that is the challenge in this struggle, I guess, is whose truth is going to be lifted up when, and how does it get addressed? Do we do POC broadly to include undocumented immigrants issues, API issues, or do we only do singular focus processes, which may prove to be a little less unwieldy going forward? But you know, the work is hard and it's challenging, but the commitment has to be there to persevere and keep going, and that's what I'm learning. So I mentioned that 7 months ago. Now we're in the process. I noticed Mark talked about homelessness issues, and now Mark is running the entire homeless process in Portland, I think it is. Seattle. Where is it, Mark? Seattle, yeah. You know, so speaking these things into existence, I mean, maybe that's a big part of it, just speaking it. And then, you know, that triggers something in the universe and brings forward those conversations.
Thank you. And so what we'll do now is we're going to take a look at another clip from that conversation. And then I want any audience members out there, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll take a look at those and then come back to some of those when we, after the video, and have some more discussion and before we close. So if our producer folks can roll us into video clip number 2, and then we'll come back and discuss it.
Thank you. You just reminded me of something my grandfather used to say. I remember one time I asked him, you know, for $2 to go to the store and buy some candy, and he said to me, "Well, how much do you need?" And I stopped and looked at him, and he said, "If you need $2, don't ask for 5, ask for 10." And that was a lesson in my life that has carried me in doing budget appropriation work at various times, which bumps me up against some of my colleagues sometimes who want to ask for what they think we could get, right? Which is what I was asking my grandfather for. So thank you for that. I just open it up for a moment. There are things that, in hearing the other panelists talk about, that sparked an idea, you know, in anyone's head. I'll open it up now for folks who, if any of the panelists have, you know, something to respond to based on the other presentations. Mark, it's you.
I was particularly taken with what Cassandra was just saying. I think. So I didn't say this in my opening, but so my job is I run a team called the National Innovation Service that's focused on the designing of new systems, right? And part of why we do that work is because of a recognition that, like, it isn't that American systems are broken, it's that they were built this way, right? Like, racism is bone deep in this country. It is built into the fundamental machinations. Misogyny is built into the fundamental machinations of this machine, right? Like, when we talk about, like, oh, like, there's this gap in a safety net, there's not a gap. That's a very specific, like, people put that hole there for a reason, and it's that they don't like you. And that, I think, is why, right, my team is focused on not just saying, like, oh, can we stitch this? Can we weave it better? But can we build something new? And I think that, you know, what Cassandra was saying in terms of like, can we actually come together and imagine what the necessary things are for us to thrive is so important, so important. Because I think that that's one of the reasons, right, why, you know, to some degree, why when we talk about sort of progressive visioning, et cetera, it doesn't necessarily like catch fire in like the rural environments or with white people broadly. I will just be candid, right? And it's because I think that like we are not sometimes having the conversation in a way that is like, hey, I'm trying to build a country where we all just do well, right? Where we like, this is not the conversation we are having, right? And I think oftentimes we have the conversation in these very sort of niche, like, oh, well, we have to focus on this population, this population, this population. And I do think that there, from a strategy perspective, in the same way that you were talking about, like, ask for $10, right? I think there's a communication strategy need for us to say, like, the country I want to build does not exist, has not existed. This is not about a return to, this is not about a fixing of a thing. This is about a fundamental imagining of a new way to live, right? And a way to live where we all thrive. And that, I think, is a thing that is absolutely necessary, particularly looking at like the half the country, like half the people who voted anyway, still voted for a fascist regime, right? Like, call a thing, it's a fascist regime built on white supremacy, running on an engine of let's kill some people. And so like, we actually have a lot of work to do in order to, because I don't think that we can just say, adios, all those people who voted for that man, right? We have like deep organizing work to do in the next 2-4 years, right? To help the rest of the country understand that the world we are trying to imagine does include them and does include their thriving.
Wow, thank you for that, Mark. You were on one that day. You just said. But actually, yes, I'm gonna kind of take this idea of you know, kind of transformation and really imagining new systems that Mark was talking to, and actually ask a question that all the panelists I would like to respond to. I mean, we're ostensibly here, obviously, with ViiV Healthcare, and many of the folks here are watching people living with HIV or whose communities are impacted by HIV. And how do you imagine, and I think I asked this question last time too, and I'm curious also 7 months later, given the kind of legacy of you know, HIV and AIDS activists in terms of really, you know, pushing this nation forward in many ways. And we're now, at least in this country, coming, it appears, out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would like to ask all of you, from your you know, vantage points, you know, how do you see the role of HIV activists and leadership kind of addressing the present moment from any of these? And we'll start with you, Andrea.
Great, yeah. You know, I'll just start by saying happy Pride to everybody. This past weekend, we know, was, you know, kind of when the first cases of HIV and AIDS were determined. But, you know, just, you know, and even I've been watching this documentary, Pride. I don't know if folks have been tuning into that at all. It's on FX, I think. You know, there was this big segment about how ACT UP had really, you know, just disrupted the whole structure. And, you know, while I was, you know, a young queer at the time, not really deeply engaged in advocacy and activism, but I knew about the work that you know, ACT UP was doing. And it feels like, you know, we're at a moment where maybe that kind of in your face, and certainly, I mean, we're experiencing it, right? Like, that is kind of what's happening right now in this moment. And, you know, people are demanding action, demanding justice, and I think we saw that in the like I said, in the ACT UP era, and they had learned their tactics from the civil rights movement and movements before them. So building on those movements as we continue to try to push for progress, to try to create new systems that work for everybody, that is going to be, that's got to be our future, and just continuing to push hard on these issues, regardless of the consequences. And I did appreciate what you said, though, Mark, around, this is a democracy, and until we figure out something different, then we have to try to operate within that sphere. But many times for our communities, that democratic process doesn't work for us. So how do we create within that context? And I think it's the fight that has to happen.
Thank you. And Mark.
I want to pick up on something that the councilmember just said, because I think it's really important. And there's a thing about ACT UP that isn't often discussed, which is the governance structure of ACT UP. ACT UP was not a consensus-based organization, very demonstrably so. Like the way ACT UP made decisions was, hey, I want to do this action. If I can convince enough people to do that action with me, it doesn't matter if other people think it's a bad idea, we're going to go do that action, right? Like, and the other people might argue, they might be like, hey, like, that's not it. Like, I don't know if that's gonna, but like, it was not a consensus-based organization. And I think that actually is quite critical, because I think, to the point about like what actually works for historically marginalized communities, it might not be consensus, right? Like that might not actually be the best way to design governance. And when I think about that, like part of what that leads me to is a systems question, a governance question about what actually is the purpose and nature of government, and how do we redefine that purpose and nature in relationship with historically marginalized communities. And one of the things that has become very clear to me over the last decade of working in the policy space is that fundamentally government is a gatekeeping function, right? Government deploys its power by gating resources. That's what we do. I'm a public administrator, I gate resources, right? And all of that is based on a scarcity model of like, we don't have enough stuff, so we got to really gate access to the stuff in order to make sure it's used in the best way, right? But I think we can, well, we don't all have to agree. I will agree with myself that we have enough stuff, because this is not a consensus-based model, so look at that. But if we operate on the idea that there actually is enough stuff, and right, that moreover, people in their sort of natural inclination are not hoarders, do not actually say, I need all the things, right? In all of my years doing work with folks experiencing homelessness and housing instability, I have not once seen somebody ask for, again, to the point you made the last time we were together, Kenyon, ask for more than they actually needed. Most people actually consistently ask for less. And it's a shame linkage, right? Of not wanting to appear like you need too much, or that you are taking advantage of a thing. But so if we operate from that perspective, then we have to begin to fundamentally ask whether or not that gatekeeping function is even really necessary in government. And what if, right, we begin to approach the question of government as being less about gatekeeping and more about providing choices? And I say this with all seriousness. What if government could become a vending machine where you walked up to any door we operate and you told us what you needed and we just did that? Like, what if that was how we use the phenomenal resource power that we have at our disposal? And that, I think, is a question, right, that pivots us fundamentally off of consensus. Because now I don't need everybody to agree with what you need. I just need you to agree with what you need.
Okay, when is the book coming out, Mark? We need a book on that theme.
That's powerful, Mark.
Right.
Yeah.
This is really like, right. Yes. So before I get caught up in my amen,
I am literally writing that quote down right now. So I will credit you, Mark. I promise.
We'll turn it over to Angel on that question. What does AIDS activism mean now in leadership?
So I thank you, Mark, for such beautiful thinking. I'm excited. I'm truly excited because I think that there are the younger generations of HIV activists and organizers are really pushing the limits and making those necessary links, and doing work from an intersectional vantage point. Something that, maybe some of us try to do very early on, in our work and our advocacy, but there were many roadblocks, and and timing was not right, for that. So I'm excited for the younger generations that are coming, on board in this and are saying, y'all have to step aside, y'all. You tried it and it was cute, but now we need something different. It's all good though. It's all good, because I think that that we need that energy, we need that motivation, and and it's a very different reality. HIV looks very different than when I came in and folks were still, dying, and I was, giving my best friends their HIV results just to bury them, a couple of months later. It's very different. Um, um, and the question about transformation, I from personal experience, I know that the transformational work begins with self. That I had to transform to hopefully a better version of me, a more healed version of me, to be able to show up differently in community and the advocacy work that I do. And so I would encourage everyone, to engage in that process if they are able to, and generational trauma, historical trauma, all those things get in the way, and contribute to this process. And I can share with folks that I am, gosh, even with all the loss around me for multiple decades, both in my personal life and my professional life, this is the healthiest that I've been able to show up in community and doing the advocacy work. And hopefully folks feel that, sense that, because that's what I'm trying to leave behind. I also self-identify as indigenous Mexican, and the philosophy around this is that, or one of the philosophies is that we're responsible for 7 generations forward and 7 generations back. So I'm hoping that whatever I'm able to leave behind in this generation has definite impacts 7 generations forward. So I'm doing it, yes, for me and the healing work for me, but also that transformational work for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you all. Such great responses. As one question in the Q&A box, it's a very sort of practical question about ViiV and given their role obviously as a industry drug maker in the HIV space, but also in this particular part of their work in terms of external affairs and community grants programs, how could ViiV make or support more of these kinds of spaces to address HIV disparities, and what types of spaces could go far that ViiV has a role in supporting? And I'll take the first stab at that. So stepping out of my role as facilitator, I usually don't like when moderators jump into the conversation. Ain't nobody asked you for that, but but in this particular case,
I like it.
I'll respond to that. I will say that you know, for me, one of the reasons why I have, you know, kind of done various kinds of work with ViiV over the last probably 7 years or so, mostly through the Accelerate Initiative and a couple of other things, is that ViiV is actually not afraid of these kinds of conversations, right? I mean, I think that like, so one is just being able to provide the resources for community to be able to engage, not just in questions about viral suppression or, you know, PrEP eligibility, like, or whatever, or, you know, a treatment cascade. And those things are important, right? In terms of, you know, doing, you know, some of the work that we need to do. But, you know, the refrain that, you know, I hear from, you know, my friends living with HIV and folks in the community all the time is like, we're more than just our sero status, and being able to feel like they can participate in discussions and in kind of shaping the world around more than just that is really critical. So in one respect, this, you know, kind of conversation and others like it, whether they be virtual or, you know, resources for groups to construct those conversations in their own communities, I think also partly because that then removes, you know, kind of HIV from being this sort of thing over here. But if the HIV group in Jackson, Mississippi is holding this conversation for anybody in Jackson who wants to participate and has the resources to do it, that goes a long way in terms of, you know, removing the kind of marginalization and the stigma and the other things that people with HIV often kind of feel when they want to participate in a range of conversations where HIV may be a part of it. They don't want to necessarily feel closeted about their sero status, but don't also want that to necessarily foreground everything that they do, you know, so that would be part of my response. I don't know if my other the panelists have anything else to say to that question.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And just maybe, I guess, articulate just even a tad bit stronger in that, you know, ViiV should be supporting conversations around housing and around, you know, disability rights. And because these are all issues that concern people living with or impacted by HIV and AIDS. And I think bring a unique and important voice to those conversations. So just completely, it's only an expansion of what you said, Kenyon, but that is so important. I mean, just that it is not just a dialogue about HIV and AIDS. And I did that work for over 12, 15 years specifically. And that is what has brought me into this broader range of advocacy and activism and policy work. It's just seeing how, you know, all of these other issues were impacting people living with and dying from HIV and AIDS, and particularly Black trans women who are still being infected and impacted by the disease, but also by all, and it potentially, I would argue that a big part of why that is because they are shut out of all the other systems in our society.
Mm-hmm.
Access to employment, access to safe and affordable healthcare, access to housing. Those issues contribute to the fact that, you know, Black and brown trans women are engaging in survival sex work, which is, you know, a gateway into HIV and AIDS. So yeah, broaden out the conversations. and not just stay focused on someone's HIV/AIDS status.
Cool. Thank you. Any other folks?
I'll hop in briefly. So one, echoing and drilling down, right? Like it's always about material resources, and efforts to make it not about material resources are boring to me, a person who uses money to pay for stuff. I don't know what else to tell you. I simply don't know what else to tell you, right? Like I use money to pay for stuff. And it turns out that again, until we make a different agreement, is how you have to buy things, right? Like it's how you like there's nothing else here, right? And so anytime I encounter this question of like what's to do, I'm always like, I don't know, you just give people money so they're not stressed about the stuff, and then they might have different conversations, right? Like, and I think it's important for us to like reassert that fundamental reality every time we have this conversation, because we often have it about transphobia, about misogyny, about racism. I think divorced from what the council member just said, which is like those things are all economic positions, right? Racism is an economic idea used to deprive people of land, of access to resources, of income, right? And so it is only material. It's why we have a conversation about reparations, right? Because it was never about whether or not you liked me. It was about whether or not I could pay for things. So like, if we're not having that conversation, I just need to be really clear, we're already lost in the sauce. And then the other thing that I would say is that I do fundamentally believe, right, that like we have to be having a different approach to like how we are sort of framing up like what we're doing. And I think part of that, and I will speak specifically as a person who now oversees a system that funds stuff, and then like just sort of like as a person who's also interacted with a lot of funders, there's this idea that when you pay for something, it has to produce, right? And I don't actually think that's how we get to transformative work, in part because the idea of production itself as like how we drive towards all things is like deeply, that's so far in the back, it thinks it's first, right? And so I think that there's work to be done about funding restoration, funding rest, funding things that don't make stuff. And so I think it's really valuable to pay for a bunch of like queer, trans people of color to go on vacation. You don't gotta ask for nothing. You just gotta be like, hey, we got this like real cute place and you can absolutely just kick out, like you ain't gotta do nothing. You gotta write a report about it. You can just rest, right? But the idea that like, again, we live inside these frameworks of oppression that drive us towards constantly trying to eke out the next thing, constantly trying to make sure that we got the next, like we don't have time to rest. The idea of rest in and of itself is revolutionary. Check Instagram for literally any account run by a queer or Black person and you will find 1,000 of those memes, right?
So true.
and there's a reason for that. And so I think that like whenever we're having a conversation, again, that is rooted in material reality, and like talks about like it's the money, my good Judy, and then from there asks like what could that money do, sever that idea of what that money could do from produce stuff, and ask how it could be part of a transformation, and let that transformation be more than the making of a report, the writing of a strategy, the engaging with electeds, right? There is more to transformation than the next grantee report.
Thank you. And Angel, in the interest of time, we have about 2 more minutes.
Yeah, I'll make it really, really quick. It's yes, ditto. Ditto to everything that was said. And I think that folks that continue to thrive on oppression have think tanks that produce policy, that produce continued oppression. What I appreciate about ViiV is that they're willing to take those risks and pull these convenings together and talk about these issues in a think tank fashion. We live these realities, and so and have lived these realities for many, many, many years. And so we have something to say. A lot of it is grounded on, we have tons of research to back up everything that we say or that we've said so far. But we don't, we're not intentional, I think, about creating these spaces to be able to have these frank conversations. Because if we really, really want to address the disparities, again, in any issue around health, in communities of color, we have to have these conversations. We need to have these conversations in order to be able to create and recreate different ways of showing up for one another and showing up, period. And so I'm grateful for that. And I'm hoping that, that can continue. And yes to rest, honey. Yes to rest. Because, I've had to make conscious decisions to not continue in the career path of HIV Inc. And pull myself away from it just because, we burn out so many folks. And so many folks are still in the field who are totally crisp and should take a break soon, hopefully.
Thank you all. So before we close, I just want to thank you all and just say quickly, Mark, what you just laid out is like around productivity. Some of my, I think, best organizing were things that funders hated and actually stopped funding. But I could see the impact of it, even sometimes not, it was years later. And I was like, oh, because I helped introduce these two people or made this thing happen, all this other stuff rolled out, right? But it wasn't a report and it wasn't a deliverable that had a kind of measurable goal. So I think more of that, is definitely critical. And then somebody, I think the issue of rest is really important. I am tired. I'm just keeping it 100. And also suffering the kinds of losses we have. I'll just briefly, from in 2021, right? We thought at the end of 2020, things were kind of gonna, hopefully let up. But, I personally, including Marco and Lauren, who I mentioned earlier, but have lost 5 other people this year, just in 2021. It's been heavy, but still feel the inertia to keep going, even when I feel like I need to tap out. So that's something I'm trying to figure out for myself. So those things. And then lastly, I saw somebody in the chat wanted to quote from my grandfather. And I'm glad you asked, because I kind of screwed it up actually when I first said it 7 months ago. Well, what my grandfather said was, if you need $5, don't ask for 2, ask for 10, right? So that's the quote. So whoever asked for that, you got it. You can write it down, credit it to Leroy Farrow. And that's where we are. So once again, I want to thank Andrea Jenkins, Mark Jones, and Angel Fabian, and our other compadre, Cassandra Frederic, who couldn't join us today. But much love and shout out to her. And thank you all for the folks who attended, who I know are all doing great work in your own right. And we will do this thing, and we will win sometime, some way, somehow. But we got this. So much love. Thank you.
Gratitude. Thank you.